She was 21 and had just been kicked out. No family left in the county, no savings, just a canvas rucksack and $1 she had earned stacking lumber at a sawmill outside Phoenicia. And with that $1, she bought a crumbling violin maker's studio above a creek in the Catskill Mountains of New York, in a stretch of Ulster County that had not heard a plane on spruce since the studio had closed in 1942. The timber frame walls had gone silver. The Varnish room door was sealed with beeswax. But what nobody knew was that hidden in the Varnish room of that old studio was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Signe Lund had grown up with the sound of tapped wood, not the sound of a hammer on a nail and not the knock of a fist on a door. The specific resonant ring of a knuckle tapped against a thin plate of carved spruce, the plate suspended by its edges on the fingertips of the other hand. The tap producing a note, a sustained musical note that rose from the wood and hung in the air for 3 or 4 seconds. The note telling the maker whether the plate was the right thickness, whether the graduation was correct, whether the arching was true, whether the wood was ready to become the top of a violin. Her grandmother had taught her to hear that note the way certain grandmothers in certain mountain villages teach a child the one thing the village has always made, by putting a carved plate in her hand and saying, "Tap it, listen. The plate is singing. If the note is clear and sustained, the plate is right. If the note is dull and short, the plate is too thick. The note tells you when to stop carving." Her grandmother's name was Elna Lund, and she had been a luthier, a woman who had built violins by hand for the musicians, teachers, and orchestras of Ulster County, New York, for 31 years. Elna had not been a factory assembler who glued prefabricated parts. Elna had been a classical luthier, a person who took raw wood, a wedge of European spruce for the top, a slab of curly maple for the back, and carved every surface by hand with gouges and thumb planes, graduating the thickness from 6 millimeters at the edges to 2.5 millimeters at the center, the graduation determining the voice of the finished instrument, the difference between a violin that sang and a violin that merely sounded. Elna had been born in 1939 in a farmhouse above the Esopus Creek, Ulster County, the daughter of a Swedish-American cabinet maker named Axel Lund, who had settled in the Catskills in 1920 because the mountains reminded him of Dalarna, and because the hardwood forests, the maples, the beeches, the cherries, produced the same figured wood that the Swedish furniture makers prized. Axel had not been a violin maker. Axel had been a woodworker who understood figured maple, the specific curly grain pattern that occurred in about 1 in 50 sugar maples, the fibers waving back and forth as they grew, producing the flame pattern that caught the light and shimmered when the surface was finished. And the shimmer was the quality that made curly maple the only acceptable wood for the back of a fine violin. The flame is the wood's music made visible, Axel told Elna. The curly fibers vibrate differently than straight fibers. They flex and spring and transmit sound the way a trampoline transmits force, and the transmission gives the violin its projection, its warmth, its ability to fill a room. Straight maple is quiet, curly maple sings. The curl is not decorative. The curl is structural. The curl is the voice. Elna had learned violin making from the instruments themselves, from studying violins that passed through the region's music shops, and from a correspondence with a luthier in Mittenwald, Germany, who had sent her templates, graduation charts, and letters explaining the classical method. She had built her first violin at 22, 8 months, thin and nasal, the plates too thick. Her second was better. By her 10th, the tone was rich and balanced, and a violinist from the Hudson Valley Philharmonic had played it and said, "This instrument projects." "Who made it?" Elna had said, "I did." The violinist said, "Make me another." Elna had also known about the old Strum studio. A mile up the creek from the Lund farmhouse on a bench where the hemlocks sheltered the building from the wind, stood a timber frame studio that had been the workshop of a man named Gunnar Strum, who had been the finest violin maker in the Catskill region from 1896 until his death in 1942. 46 years of carving and graduating and tuning and varnishing violins in the classical European tradition. Gunnar Strum's violin sang, Elna told Sina once on a winter afternoon when they were graduating a top plate at the bench. A Strum violin sitting on a shelf in a room where music was being played would vibrate in sympathy. The soundboard resonating with the notes in the air, the violin responding to music it was not producing. I saw it once. A cellist was playing in the parlor, and Gunnar's violin was on a shelf across the room, and the strings were vibrating. The bridge was transmitting. The belly was resonating. The violin was playing itself because the plates were so perfectly graduated that they responded to the frequencies in the room. Elna had told Sina other stories from the bench, each one a lesson. She told Sina about the top plate. The top was carved from a wedge of spruce, typically European spruce, Picea abies, with tight, even grain, the growth rings spaced about 1 millimeter apart. The wedge was split from the log along the grain because splitting followed the natural fiber structure and produced a stronger plate than sawing. The split wedge was carved, first the outside arching using gouges, and then the inside graduation, carved with thumb planes, the thickness measured with a dial caliper at dozens of points. The graduation is the voice, Elna told Sina. The thickness at every point determines how that point vibrates when the strings are bowed, and the pattern of vibration across the entire plate determines the tone. Thicker at the center, about 2.8 millimeters, for strength and fundamental tone. Thinner at the edges, about 2.2, for flexibility and overtones. And the transition must be gradual, no sudden steps, because a sudden change creates a node, and a node is a dead spot where the plate does not vibrate, and a dead spot is a frequency the violin cannot produce. She told Sina about the F-holes, the two curved openings in the top plate that allowed the air inside the body to vibrate. The F-holes were acoustic ports. Their size, shape, and position determined the air resonance, the deep, low-frequency component of the instrument's voice. The position of the F-holes determined the position of the bridge, which determined the vibrating length of the strings, which determined the tuning. The F-holes are the violin's lungs, Elna told Sina. The body breathes through the F-holes. Every time the top plate flexes, the air inside is compressed and released, and the release produces the air tone. The air tone gives the violin its depth. Without the F-holes, the violin would be thin and sharp, all string, no air. She told Sina about the bass bar, a long strip of spruce glued to the underside of the top plate, running lengthwise under the bass side foot of the bridge. The bass bar reinforced the plate and transmitted vibrations across its full length. Without it, the vibrations would concentrate under the bridge, and the plate would flex unevenly. The bass bar is the spine of the top plate, Elna told Sina. The correct bass bar is the lightest bar that holds the plate, the minimum structure for the maximum vibration. 1/4 millimeter too heavy and the plates cannot open. 1/4 millimeter too light and the plate collapses under string tension. She told Sina about the varnish, the most debated subject in violin making. Classical violin varnish was an oil varnish, linseed oil, resin, and a colorant, applied in 12 to 20 thin coats over several weeks. Each coat brushed on, dried in sunlight, and rubbed with pumice between coats. The varnish protected the wood, but also affected the tone. A varnish that was too thick dampened the vibrations. A varnish that was too thin wore off quickly. The varnish does not improve the tone, Elna told Sina. The varnish preserves the tone. An unvarnished violin sounds the best it will ever sound, open, resonant, full. Every coat of varnish takes a fraction of that sound away. The varnish is the tax the wood pays for immortality. She told Sina about the specific relationship between the maker and the wood, The fact that a violin maker did not impose a shape on the wood, but discovered the shape the wood contained. Every piece of spruce was different grain spacing, different density, different stiffness. And the graduation that produced the best tone in one piece of spruce was not the graduation that produced the best tone in another. The maker had to listen to each piece of wood individually, tapping as she carved, adjusting the graduation to match the wood's own resonant frequencies. The wood has a voice before you carve it, Elna told Sina. Your job is not to give the wood a voice. Your job is to free the voice the wood already has. You free it by removing everything that is muffling it, the excess thickness, the uneven graduation, the nodes. When the voice is free, the plate sings. She told Sina about wood selection, the first and most consequential decision a luthier made because no amount of carving skill could compensate for the wrong piece of wood. The spruce for a violin top had to be quarter-sawn, the growth rings running perpendicular to the surface, because quarter-sawn spruce was stiffer across the grain than along it, and the differential stiffness was what allowed the plate to vibrate in the complex patterns that produced the overtone series that gave each violin its individual character. Flat-sawn spruce, growth rings running parallel to the surface, vibrated uniformly, and uniform vibration produced a flat, characterless tone. Quarter-sawn spruce sings, Elna told Sina. Flat-sawn spruce drones. The difference is in the angle of the rings. Perpendicular rings create a plate that is stiff in one direction and flexible in the other, and the difference between stiff and flexible is what produces the overtones. Without the overtones, a violin is a tuning fork, one note, one frequency, no character. The maple for the back had to be figured, the curly grain that Axel had identified as the structural source of the violin's projection. But not all figure was equal. Tight curl, waves spaced less than 2 millimeters apart, produced a back that was stiff and bright. Wide curl, waves spaced 5 or 6 millimeters apart, produced a back that was flexible and warm. The luthier selected the figure to match the intended character of the instrument. Tight curl for a solo violin that needed to cut through an orchestra. Wide curl for a chamber violin that needed to blend. The figure is the personality, Elna told Sina. Tight figure is the extrovert, loud, bright, projecting. Wide figure is the introvert, warm, deep, blending. The luthier is a matchmaker, matching the figure to the player, matching the personality of the wood to the personality of the musician. A bright player on a bright violin is too much. A warm player on a warm violin is too little. The match is the art. She told Sina about the ribs, the thin strips of maple that form the sides of the violin body, connecting the top plate to the back plate. The ribs were about 1.5 millimeters thick, thin enough to bend around the curves of the mold without breaking, thick enough to hold their shape permanently once bent. The ribs were bent on a hot iron, a curved iron bar heated over a flame. The luthier pressing the moistened maple strip against the hot iron, the heat softening the fibers, the strip conforming to the curve. 6 ribs per violin. 2 C-bows, the concave curves in the middle. 2 upper bouts, 2 lower bouts, each one bent individually, each one fitted to the mold, the joints tight, the curves smooth. The ribs are the corset, Elna told Sina. The ribs hold the plates at the correct distance apart, about 30 millimeters, and the distance determines the volume of air inside the body, and the volume determines the air resonance, and the air resonance is the bass voice. The ribs look simple. The ribs are not simple. 1 millimeter of difference in the rib height changes the air volume by 8%, and 8% changes the air resonance by a full tone. Elna had married a man named Soren Lund, a cousin, a timber cruiser in the Catskill forest who had understood that a wife who spent her days carving spruce with thumb planes was a wife whose ears were tuned to frequencies most people could not hear. Soren had died in 2004. Elna had continued alone. Elna and Soren had had one daughter, a woman named Karen who was Sina's mother. Karen had left Ulster County at 19, had moved to Albany, had worked at a call center, had had Sina with a man named Doug who had worked at a warehouse and who had left Karen when Sina was 5. Karen had raised Sina alone in a small apartment in Albany on the call center salary, and the apartment had smelled of headset plastic and microwaved leftovers. And Sina had spent every summer at Elna's farmhouse because the farmhouse smelled of spruce shavings and varnish and maple dust, and the specific resinous scent of old tonewoods, a smell like pine forest and vanilla. Sina had been at the farmhouse every summer from the age of 5, and every school break from the age of 7. Elna had put her to work immediately, at the bench, at the caliper. Elna had taught Sina to tap tune at 6. She had placed a carved spruce plate in Sina's small hands and had said, "Hold it by the edges. Just your fingertips. Tap the center with your knuckle. Listen." Sina had tapped. The plate rang, a clear note that rose from the wood and hung in the air. "That's the tap tone," Elna said. "Now tap near the edge." A different note, higher, thinner. The center is thicker. The edge is thinner. Thicker makes a lower note. Thinner makes a higher note. When you're carving, you tap as you go. The note tells you the thickness. The note tells you when to stop. By 8, Sina could identify whether a plate was too thick or too thin by the tap tone alone. By 10, Elna had taught her to carve, holding the gouge at the correct angle, pushing it through the spruce, the shaving curling off the blade, the surface getting thinner, the tap tone getting higher with each pass. By 12, she could graduate a plate, measuring, carving, tapping, measuring the thickness approaching the target 1/10 of a millimeter at a time. By 15, Elna had taught her to cut F-holes, the most nerve-wracking step, because the F-holes were cut into the finished plate, and a mistake could not be undone. The F-holes must match, Elna told Sina. Not approximately, exactly. If one is wider than the other, the air resonance splits, 2 frequencies instead of 1, and the split produces a wavering in the low notes. Matching F-holes produce 1 clean resonance, 1 voice. By 17, Sina had built her first violin, spruce top, curly maple back, ebony fingerboard, her own F-holes, Elna's oil varnish. The tone was warm, but not yet projecting. Elna had played it and had said, "The plates are right, the graduation is good, the F-holes match, but the bass bar is a 1/4 millimeter too heavy. That 1/4 millimeter is holding the plates back." Sina shaved the bass bar. The plates opened. Elna had died when Sina was 18. A quiet death at the farmhouse on a Saturday morning in October. She had been sitting at the bench with a top plate in the cradle, a thumb plane in her hand, a curl of spruce on the floor, the last pass she had made. She had been 84. Sina had taken Elna's thumb plane, a small brass-bodied plane about 3 inches long, the sole worn concave from 31 years of graduating plates, and her tuning fork, a steel fork ground to concert A440. After Elna's death, Karin had not wanted Sina. Sina had gotten a job stacking lumber at a sawmill outside Phoenicia, $11 an hour, and had rented a room in a shared house. The house had been condemned. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever tapped a piece of wood and heard it sing, a clear note that hung in the air, and known that the wood was telling you something about itself? She had $1 in her pocket and no car. She had Elna's thumb plane and the tuning fork in her rucksack. She was in the general store in Phoenicia the following week, buying a tin of coffee with her last change, when she overheard 2 men at the counter. One was talking about old buildings. "The Strom studio above the creek is still standing," the man said. "Counties had it on the surplus list since 2003. $1. The Varnish room is still sealed. Nobody opened it because the beeswax is still intact." The other man said, "My grandfather had Gunnar Strom build a violin for his daughter in 1938. She played it for 40 years. She said the violin knew the weather. It sounded different on a rainy day than a sunny day because the wood responded to the humidity, and the response was not a flaw, but a conversation. Sina set down her coffee. "Where do I sign for it?" The first man looked at her. "County clerk's office in Kingston. You a maker?" Sina said, "My grandmother was." The man paused. "Elna Lund was your grandmother?" Sina said, "Yes, sir." The man said, "Elna made a violin for my daughter in 2001. My daughter played it through Juilliard. The concertmaster at her recital asked to see it, played it for 30 seconds, and said, 'This instrument has a voice. The plates are singing.'" She walked to the Ulster County clerk's office in Kingston the next morning. The clerk, a woman in her 50s named Mrs. Van Etten, stamped the deed and handed Sina an iron key on a loop of catgut string. "The Strum Studio, above the creek," Mrs. Van Etten said. "Gunner's granddaughter brought this key in 1943 and said, 'Give it to whoever hears the plate.' We held it." She looked at Sina. "Elna Lund was your grandmother?" Sina said, "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Van Etten said, "Elna repaired the concertmaster's violin for the Kingston Symphony in 2005. She regraduated the top plate, shaved 1/10 of a millimeter from the upper bout, and the violinist said the instrument woke up. He said 1/10 of a millimeter was the difference between a violin that projected to the balcony and a violin that stopped at the 10th row." She hitched a ride up the creek road that afternoon. The studio stood on the bench above the creek, sheltered by hemlocks, a timber frame building with a cedar shake roof, a stone chimney, a heavy plank door, and on the north side, the varnish room, sealed with darkened beeswax around the frame. She put the key in the lock. It turned. One room, timber frame walls, a wide plank floor, heavy beams. Against the south wall, a luthier's workbench with a cradle for holding plates and a gooseneck light. Against the west wall, a wood rack with aged billets of spruce and curly maple. The maple flamed, the curl visible in the end grain. Against the east wall, a tool rack with faint outlines and dust. The varnish room was through the sealed door. Sina worked a knife around the beeswax. The wax crumbled. The door opened. A small room, plastered walls, a shuttered north window. On a wooden shelf against the back wall, an unfinished violin, a white violin, plates carved and graduated and assembled but never varnished, the spruce and maple pale and raw. Beside it, a leather tool roll, and beneath the shelf, a heavy canvas pouch and a thick leather-bound book. The tool roll held a matched set of luthier's hand tools, 6 graduating gouges, a brass-soled thumb plane identical to Elna's, F-hole knives and files, a base bar fitting plane, a varnish brush with badger hair and a graduated caliper marked in tenths of millimeters. Each tool was stamped GS, Gunnar Strum. The white violin was extraordinary. The top was spruce with grain so tight the rings were barely visible, a 100-year tree. The back was one-piece curly maple, the flame running across the full width, deep and even, the raw wood already shimmering when she tilted it. The plates were assembled, glued to the ribs, F-holes cut, base bar fitted, neck set, complete except for fingerboard, pegs, tailpiece, strings, and varnish. 82 years in the sealed room, the beeswax keeping the air stable, the wood unchanged. The canvas pouch held gold coins, 37 Liberty Quarter Eagles, dated between 1896 and 1941. The coin dealer in Kingston valued them at approximately $24,000. The book was a luthier's journal, page after page in Swedish and English. Each entry noted the date, customer, wood source, plate thicknesses at 12 points, tap tone frequencies, varnish formula, number of coats, and a quality note. September 14, 1927, violin number 31, Bavarian spruce top, 110-year tree, Catskill, curly maple back, 1 piece, 2.7 mm center / 2.2 mm edge, taptone 178 Hz, oil varnish, 16 coats, the finest plates I have carved. The taptone sustains for 4.2 seconds, and the sustain is the voice. 46 years of violins. The journal was the acoustic record of the Catskills. Tucked inside the front cover was a folded letter. To whoever breaks this seal. My name is Gunnar Strum. I have built violins in this studio from 1896 until today, the 2nd of October, 1942. I am 68 years old. The factories have come. The factories build violins from plywood tops and painted maple and machine-cut F-holes. And the violins look like violins, but they do not sing, because plywood does not vibrate and machine-cut F-holes do not match. I am leaving my tools and my savings and my last violin and my journal in the varnish room because the varnish room is sealed, and what is sealed in stable air will not change. The violin is white. The plates are ready. The taptone is true. Varnish it. Gunnar Strum, luthier, the 2nd of October, 1942. Sina read the letter twice. Then she picked up the white violin and held it by the neck in her left hand and tapped the top plate with the knuckle of her right. One tap, clean, at the center of the lower bout. The plate rang. The note rose from the spruce, clear, sustained, pure, and hung in the air of the varnish room for 4 seconds, the plaster walls reflecting the note back, the note decaying slowly, evenly. She did not cry, and she did not speak. She simply held the violin and listened to the ring fade and understood that the note was the plate's voice, and the voice was correct. The graduation was right, the arching was true. And the voice had been waiting in the sealed room for 82 years, unchanged. Because spruce stored in stable air does not change, and a taptone that was true in 1942 was still true in 2026. She said, quietly to the varnish room and the studio and the hemlocks beyond, "Thank you, Mr. Strum. I will varnish it." The next morning, she hitched a ride to Kingston and deposited the coin dealer's check at the bank on Wall Street. She opened a checking account and walked out into the October light. The following week, she bought a used truck, a 1999 Ford Ranger with 188,000 miles and Catskill mud on the fenders, from a retired teacher in Saugerties for $1,400. The first month was the chimney and the varnish room window. The chimney was choked with decades of creosote, and the varnish room's shuttered window needed new hinges for controlled light during varnishing. Sina bought a chimney brush and brass hinges from the hardware store in Kingston for $30. Mrs. Van Etten from the clerk's office drove up the creek road one Saturday morning with linseed oil and helped Sina oil the hinges. Gunnar Strum made 47 violins in this studio, Mrs. Van Etten said. My grandfather counted them. He said Gunnar's violins had a warmth that filled the sanctuary the way sunlight fills a window, not by being loud, but by being everywhere. She made the studio livable in pieces. She bought a folding army cot from the thrift store in Kingston for $8 and set it against the east wall near the wood rack, so she could lie in the dark and smell the aged spruce and maple. She found a small cast-iron parlor stove at an estate sale in Woodstock for $25, and a man named Mr. Hasbrook, who ran the sawmill down the creek, helped Sina fit the stovepipe. Your grandmother made a violin for my wife in 2001, Mr. Hasbrook said. My wife plays it every evening. She says the violin knows the house. It sounds different in winter than in summer because the wood responds to the humidity, and the response is a conversation, and a violin that converses with its environment is alive. He came back every Saturday after that with firewood and coffee. The first fire she lit in the parlor stove, dry hemlock splits from a deadfall above the creek, filled the studio with a warmth that traveled across the plank floor and up the timber walls, and the wood warmed and released the ghost scent of spruce shavings and varnish and maple dust that had been sealed in the timbers for 82 years, and the studio smelled for the first time since 1942, like a place where violins were being made. Sina sat on the cot and watched the firelight play across the workbench and the wood rack and the varnish room doorway, and thought, Gunnar stood at that bench for 46 years. Elna stood at hers for 31. The spruce sings the same way in any century. She set Elna's photograph on the workbench. Elna at the bench in 2003, thumb plane in hand, a top plate in the cradle. She placed both thumb planes on the bench, Elna's and Gunnar's side by side, both brass-soled, both worn concave. She hung the luthier's journal from an iron nail on the beam above the bench, open to the first entry, April 8, 1896. First violin in this studio, Catskill spruce top, Catskill maple back. The spruce is local, not European, and the grain is wider than I prefer, but the tap tone is good. The wood sings. I will build with what the mountain provides. She got a job in her second year. A string repair shop in Woodstock hired her 2 days a week, because the owner, a woman named Ms. Kurosawa, had heard from Mrs. Van Etten that a young woman at the Strum studio had varnished Gunnar's last violin. Ms. Kurosawa had driven to the studio and had played the finished violin. Sina had varnished it in 16 coats of Gunnar's oil formula over 4 weeks. Ms. Kurosawa played a Bach partita and set the violin down. The plates are alive. The tap tone sustains. The F holes match perfectly. And the varnish has not killed the voice. How many coats? Sina said. 16. Miss Kurosawa said, most makers do 20. Those extra 4 coats are 4 layers of dampening. Your violin sings because you stopped at 16. Sina said, Gunnar's journal says 16. He said the varnish is the tax the wood pays for immortality. I kept the tax as low as possible. On a clear evening in late October of her 24th year, Sina sat on the stone step outside the studio and watched the last copper light fade across the Catskill ridgeline. The hemlock stood dark above the creek. The hardwoods on the slopes were turning copper and gold. The creek ran below. Inside the studio, the stove ticked. The workbench held the violin she was building now, her second, and the journal hung open, and the 2 thumb planes lay on the bench, and Gunnar's violin sat in a cradle on the shelf, varnished amber red, the curly maple shimmering, catching the last light. She thought about Gunnar, who had stood at that bench for 46 years, carving plates because he had understood that the graduation was the voice, and a plate that was a 1/4 millimeter too thick was a plate that could not sing. She thought about Axel, who had taught his daughter that the curl in the maple was not decorative, but structural. The curl was the voice. And she thought about Elna, who had made violins for 31 years and who had put a carved plate in a 6-year-old's hands and said, tap it, listen, the plate is singing. That's the thing about the wood our grandmothers teach us to hear. We do not always know, when we are 6 years old and tapping a piece of carved spruce with our knuckle and hearing the note hang in the air, that the hearing is itself the trade. We learn it slowly, summer by summer, plate by plate. And then, 3 years after the old woman dies, we break a beeswax seal and find the violin of the man who carved plates for 46 years, and we understand what she had been teaching us. She had been teaching us that the graduation is the voice. She had been teaching us that the varnish is the tax the wood pays for immortality, and the trade is the listening, the patience to tap the plate and trust what the wood is singing. Signe Lund was 21 years old and kicked out. She had $1 to her name, and she spent it on a crumbling violin maker's studio above a creek in the Catskill Mountains of New York. It was the best $1 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Thank you for being here. See you on the next Quiet Road.